Hey class, in this video we're going to talk about how you are going to achieve focus when you are photographing, let's say, freezing action. Let's review manual focus. So with manual focus, you are going to be manually moving the focus ring of your lens until you start to see your image appear to be in focus in your viewfinder. And there is an indicator that will help you to see to confirm if the camera truly is also in focus. So one way to do this is you're going to hold your shutter button halfway, okay, and then you're going to turn your focus ring, which would be for the most part at the very top portion of your lens. Don't confuse that with the zoom barrel, okay. So look at your focus ring, and as you turn the focus ring, you'll start to see your image go in and out of focus. And you're going to hold the shutter halfway. And then when you are in focus, you will see a focus dot appear somewhere in your viewfinder. And what that means is wherever your focus point is located, let's say the focus point was located in the center of the viewfinder and it's on the person's nose here. If you turn that focus ring to a certain amount, it'll eventually become in focus. You will see it in focus through your viewfinder, and your camera will confirm that you truly are in focus when you do see that focus indicator light up in your viewfinder. That's one way to determine whether you're going to have a focus shot of your subject or not. So let's say you're going to photograph an action scene, okay? So this shot was taken in New York City outside the Met Museum, and after the museum closes, people start filing out, and they have these street performers waiting for patrons to exit, and they tell them to stay and hang out because they're going to perform a show for the patrons who are leaving the now closed museum. So I happened to be exiting the Met on this trip and came across these street performers. And this is kind of like Venice Beach. If you've ever been to Venice Beach, they have these street performers on the boardwalk there, and these guys would ask some volunteers from the audience and say that they're going to. One of them's going to do a front flip over a certain number of people in front of everybody, right? So while they're explaining all of this information to the crowd and getting them all hyped up, they were telling the audience where they were going to run and perform that stunt. So I kind of positioned myself to a location where I felt that they were going to, where the action was going to appear, and I can get a good vantage point, right, as best as I can. So I position myself, and this guy who actually did the front flip, he's not in the frame yet. He's on camera right somewhere at a good distance because he's going to do a running start. But I know he's going to come running at some point when he says so and do a front flip. So I know that's going to happen, right? So how do I focus on an action that hasn't even happened yet? Well, what you could do is pre-focus. If you know where the action is about to happen, you can pre-focus in an area where the action is going to take place. So that way when the action does happen, you will already have been in focus. Okay, so I know he's going to be doing a front flip over all of these people here. So the action is going to take place right above these people. So what I did was I pre-focus on this belt or on this person's back here, even though that person isn't doing his flip yet, right? So how do I know that's going to actually work to be in focus? So let me go back to our textbook, and if you could refer to your textbook at page 42, there's a diagram here that talks about the plane of critical focus. Okay. The plane of critical focus is the distance between your camera and the object in the scene where you have achieved focus. Okay, and imagine that there is this plane that is around your focus point. It kind of looks like this rectangle here. Okay? And in theory, your camera will be focused kind of on a sort of this flat imaginary surface, right, from top to bottom, parallel to your camera. So imagine if your camera is pointed this way, perfectly straight, then this imaginary plane of focus, everything within this plane would be, in theory, in focus. Okay? So if you focus somewhere between the statue of the dog's eyes and his nose, somewhere in the middle, this whole thing would be in focus from top to bottom, assuming that you are holding your camera straight vertical, just like this this imaginary plane here. So that's kind of the technique that I used. And your depth of field, remember depth of field, if you your f-stop number, the larger the number, the more of your scene will be in focus. So if you have a larger depth of field, meaning a larger number, f8, f11, then you'll get more things in front of your critical plane of focus and more things in the back of it to be in what's called acceptable focus or acceptably sharp. Right? You have much more chances of it getting in focus. If you were to shoot at shallow depth of field, meaning like a lower number, f5.6, f4, then you will have less of a depth of field, and this whole area here that you're seeing would be much more narrower. So imagine this image of the eye here, right? If you focused on just the eye with a shallow depth of field, notice how blurry the nose is and how the ear starts to get blurry and the background gets blurry. Shallow depth of field. Right? If you increase your depth of field, you'll get more in the front and the back. But the idea is that this plane of focus would be entirely in focus, right? So going back to the shot here, if I'm focusing on here, in theory, from top to bottom, this imaginary plane of focus, he's going to actually intersect with that imaginary plane of focus. So in theory, the street performer would be in focus as well. And plus, I think I'm shooting at f8, so I'm getting a little bit of allowance in the front and a little bit of allowance in the back to get me more of the scene in focus. So I pre-focused. Of course, I'm metering. I'm setting my shutter speed to a high shutter speed first. Then I meter for whatever the appropriate f-stop would be for that shutter speed in this lighting condition. And then I'm focusing in a critical area where I believe the action is going to intersect with my critical plane of focus, and I just wait. And I hear the street performer say, "All right, here I come." And he's running, and I just wait until I see him appear in my frame, and then I take the picture. Okay. There's one other thing I want to talk about in this. We're talking about this predictability of action. Sometimes you may be able to predict where things are going to happen, just like the previous shot that I showed you. This is an image of my cousin who works for, a photograph taken by my cousin who works for the Associated Press, he's a freelance photographer, photojournalist, and he does get access to sporting events, and he's one of those guys that you may see on the sidelines with the big honking telephoto lens. Well, he's done sports photography, and basketball, and so he's very accustomed to knowing where the action is going to happen. So there's something called the peak of action. The peak of action is the moment where the action is briefly motionless, just for a fraction of a moment there. So imagine jumping up in the air, and then at some point, because of gravity, you will end up having to go back down. Like some people, like Michael Jordan, seem to defy gravity. They seem to be hanging in the air for a long time. But even he has to come down at some point because he has to succumb to gravity. But there is a moment in time, and it seems like he's up there forever, where he's kind of motionless. He's still in the air. That's the peak of action. If you understand what's about to happen, then you will want to photograph them at the peak of action. That's kind of where they're almost kind of motionless. So you'd have to anticipate when and where that moment would occur, and you have to position yourself accordingly. Of course, getting your settings all together, right? Shutter speed, exposure is correct, and then of course maybe possibly pre-focusing as well. Very similar to what, the previous shot with the street performer flipping over all of those people in that photograph. Okay, so that's focusing, or what's called pre-focusing, for capturing an action shot, and also the idea of peak action. Okay.